Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula with Adam and Rob, where we've survived the triple header and we're in the home stretch until the summer break. Rob, how are you holding up?
Adam, it's been a busy triple header, a lot of very surprising results, and I think with the resurgence of Mercedes, it's an exciting time heading into Hungary because I think at the start of the season, none of us would have predicted the Silver Arrows to be front and center after Silverstone.
The 8-time Constructors Champ shirt is back out after the back-to-back wins from my boys, so a very, very happy week for us. And we have an extra special episode for you all today. We're joined by an experienced commentator, racing driver, and the founder of Brundle Motorsports. It's the one and only Alex Brundle. Alex, welcome to the Fantasy Formula.
Thanks very much for having me on, guys. Really appreciate it, and good to hear everything about what you're doing here with the podcast. I'm of course a fantasy F1 participant, so I'm eager to get your tips as much as you are to get my opinions.
Well, by the end of this, we're going to make you an F1 fantasy expert just like us. Don't you worry.
Great, I appreciate that. I need to be, because Laura Winter at the moment is destroying all of us. So I need as much help as I can get.
Well, we've seen you on F1 TV quite a bit talking about fantasy with Laura and Chris and all the other F1 TV crew, and we've had them on the show as you know. So it's incredible that we've got a third member of the F1 TV cast on as well. I wanted to kick things off, Alex, around your experience in the commentary box. You're also having a very busy season with F1, F2, F3. You're competing in the 24 hours of Nürburgring all the way up to Brundle Motorsport. Could you just give us a quick day in the life for Alex Brundle, how you balance all your competing priorities and how you manage to, put all of your energy into all of these different ventures?
So basically, I split my week between the whatever I'm calling on the weekend. So that starts on Thursday, where I know I should probably start chronologically on Monday or Sunday, wherever your week starts. But that starts on Thursday, and I do like a day's focused work on preparing or traveling, and then preparing with the focused work on whatever that is. Then once obviously you deliver the commentary, the presentation all the way through the weekend. Then once that's finished, I kind of take Monday morning to myself. And then after that, I go back to the projects that I have racing classic cars with Brundle Motorsport for our various sponsors and partners. And also my own racing, the fitness work that goes on with that. And also, the preparation and everything around that takes me back through to Wednesday, and then that's pretty much it. So kind of Monday morning's my weekend, and then we go again.
That's a very busy schedule that I'm sure not many of us would ever be able to balance if we're in that seat. Now, you just mentioned before the preparation that goes into competing, and you had successes winning the European Le Mans, the 24 Hours of Nürburgring in 2019. I did a mini Le Mans style karting race a few weeks ago at the Pocono Raceway here in the United States. That obviously pales in comparison to the kind of experiences you've had on track. But I found it very fascinating watching the Le Mans this year and comparing the kind of preparation and strategy that goes into that compared to a typical Formula One race that we would watch every other week. How does the preparation and mindset differ for these endurance style races as opposed to the single-seater cockpit racing through F1 to F3?
I mean, you have to be quite sharp still. It's still tight racing all the way through those kind of races. So it's not like, you just relax and settle in for the long haul and so on and so forth. You've got to prepare more as a team because you're a team of drivers going for those races. I think the main thing to do for a big endurance race like that is you split it up into a kind of a sequence of runs in your mind. If you break it down and say, okay, I'm going to actually drive, let's say it used to be 6 Grand Prix-ish or longish race distances over 24 hours, then between them I'm going to disconnect from what the race has in store completely. So allow your mind to move away from what is going on in the race, and then settle, and then go back and drive the next race for you, if that makes sense. So I think it's all about compartmentalizing it and dividing it. So otherwise it's just way too much for the mind and body to take on.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because you do see these longer stints, which would far exceed even the length of a normal race distance we'd see in Formula One. So I do admire the endurance, the tenacity, the fitness of people that compete in the endurance championships, because I feel like with F1 these days, it is front and center of a lot of sports fans' minds in the motorsport part of this industry. But yeah, it is really fascinating, and it's great to get that kind of insight. One other question I'd like to pick your brains on is, Adam mentioned before Brundle Motorsport, and you founded this earlier this year, if I'm not mistaken. Also understand that you rebuilt a Ford Mustang from 1965 that you've dubbed the Brustang. Can you tell us a bit about Brundle Motorsport, as it is still quite new, how it started? Are there any other classic or vintage cars on the horizon for you that you may well consider rebuilding or driving in the future?
So the idea of Brundle Motorsport is to basically resell those cars to a new generation. So I was involved in classic vintage racing over the last sort of 4 years or so. And when I started off, it was very much along the lines of, do I really want to drive this? I was going to event and being offered drives in these old cars. What I realized from behind the steering wheel first is it's just amazing. It's technical, it's skillful, it's exciting, and the cars are beautiful as well to visually look at and see driven. So I kind of looked at that as an aging area of motorsport, even though it is a growth area of motorsport, and thought, what can we do to actually continue to get people interested in these cars and continue to make sure they don't have a legacy and end up on a scrap heap as well, because the most ecologically friendly car is the car that already exists, because you don't have to build it, right? So to make sure those cars don't end up on a scrap heap, well, where do we consume all our content? Where are we talking right now? Online, yeah? So a next generation to find those cars online is what Brundle Motorsport is all about. And so we're doing things like taking YouTubers and sticking them in cars from 1965 and seeing how they get on. Press the go button, see how they get on. We're halfway through it. To answer the second part of your question, we're halfway through a Mark 1 Mini Cooper right now. Actually, just finished a Mark 1 Mini Cooper right now. So we have an exciting name coming to debut that car in a few weeks' time in racing conditions. So that's good.
That's really cool. I think, the way not just Formula One, but motorsport generally are going with the younger generation, I think what you're doing really opens the door for that younger crowd, as you say, coming through and seeing what is on offer outside of just Formula One in itself. Hopefully we do get to see some of these cars go around. I know Silverstone particularly does, older car circuits or runs from time to time. So we'd love to see, hopefully, some of those cars on track at some point. And I know Adam in particular wants to cover off Silverstone in detail with you. So that probably makes for a very nice segue into your home race, which we've just finished up.
Sure. So, Alex, there are two topics outside of our hit list this week that I wanted to dive in with you, because to start the weekend, Haas finally announced that Ollie Bearman will join them in 2025. And you've been calling Ollie's races in the feeder series, including his most recent win in the F2 Sprint at Austria. What has Ollie shown you to prove that he's ready for a full-time seat in F1?
I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think he's one of the first drivers ever that's benefited so much from the FP1 rookie regulations as to get them through into F1. Whether Ollie would have made it on the strength of this year's Formula 2 results into Formula 1, questionable. Last year, outstanding, brilliant. Of course, we've got a change of the specification of car this year, and I don't think his team in Formula 2, Prema, have quite got their head around it. I do know in the background that whenever he's jumped in a Formula 1 car, both in and outside an F1 weekend, he's been outstanding. And not just pretty good, but outstanding. And that, I think, is what's got him the drive at the end of the day. This year in Formula 2, they're coming on strong. Both him and Kimi Antonelli across the garage at Prema are coming on strong now. but I don't think it's been a particularly good start to the season for him. To answer your question, the results and the runs in a Formula One car are really what's got him this opportunity.
And you covered off a very popular question too, because a lot of people will compare the F1 driver rankings where Bearman sits there with how low he is in the F2 rankings. And you talked about how Prema had struggled with the car, and that's why he's so worthy of Formula One seat. He really dominates when he's in that F1 machinery. So dispelling a very common internet myth with that, which is good. Yeah. So Ollie was one of 3 F2 drivers plus Jack Doohan to take part in FP1 last weekend. What drivers would you like to see get a free practice drive before the end of the season?
I think Paul Aron needs to get a run in a Formula One car. He's been outstanding this year, and I think that he has put extremely meritorious results in the Formula 2 Championship. I'd like Théo Pourchaire to get another opportunity behind the wheel of a Formula 1 car. It's been a little bit messy sometimes, the actual session running that he's had. I'd also like to throw... I mean, I know that the regulations are a little bit messy around when he can and cannot run exactly with regards to super licenses and so on, but I would like to see Kimi Antonelli actually thrown in the shark pit of a Formula One car before the end of the season, if it's possible. I think that would be a really interesting moment, because you hear that Antonelli, in the background of the Formula One testing, the historical car testing that he's doing, again, a little bit like Bearman, has been outstanding in a way that is not shining through necessarily in his Formula 2 in his Formula 2 results, although I know he did score better results just recently. So those are the drivers that I'd like to see. But Aaron is the one where I'm like, wow, I really didn't see anything of that, as much of that as perhaps we should have done given his results in lower Formula before he started in Formula 2 this year.
That makes a lot of sense. He's been duking it out with Isaac Hadjar at the top of the F2 standings, and we've seen Hadjar as recently as this past weekend, so it'll be interesting to see if Aaron can get that drive too. Now, I know he's a little bit too young, but the regulations recently changed about the age of providing a super license. Do you think Arvid Lindblad would get a ride maybe as early as next year in FP1?
Yeah, I mean, wow, that would be quite a thing, wouldn't it? Arvid Lindblad did the double last weekend, of course. Again, coming on really strong. It's going to depend a lot on what happens at Red Bull, because he's obviously a Red Bull connected junior. So what Lindblad is basically waiting for is Red Bull to make a continuous and evolving decision on Perez. We know that that there have been noises coming out of that team that they're not happy about the performance of Sergio, but they've made those kind of noises before and retained a driver who's then gone on to deliver. I mean, in the shape of Sergio himself, right? So at the beginning of this year, everything was fine. So it's a case of how that evolves, I think, for Lindblad to sort of do the rocket ship into the back of Formula One.
His results so far in Formula 3 have been stunning, so I hope to see him in a car sometime soon. Now, I have just been bubbling with excitement over my favorite news from the weekend, and that is win number 104 for Lewis Hamilton, because it had been 945 days since his last win, and running a brilliant race in those mixed conditions. For those of us who weren't there, Alex, what was the scene like when he took the checkered flag?
I mean, that was unbelievable, wasn't it? To watch Lewis 2.5 years away from a win, come back and wave the national flag in front of... You've got to remember that's a motorsport crowd who've queued through sun and rain to watch him in Formula Renault and Formula 3 and watch his rise, awesome moves in GP2 when it was called GP2. They've seen that driver grow into a global sensation, in terms of a brand, one of the hugest brands in global sport, so to then come back and have an emotional victory there was just, the place was electric. It hummed with sort of emotional energy, which was an incredible thing to witness. It was one of those where were you remember where you were moments. It really was.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I have an interesting question for you, because I think you're uniquely positioned to weigh in on this. There was a moment after the race where he hugged his dad, and it was a real full circle moment to me back to Abu Dhabi 2021, where Anthony consoled him after arguably the toughest moment of his career. As someone who shares that passion for motorsport with his father, what's it like to share moments like that with them?
You know, the dad and lad way of, particularly in the era that Lewis came through and came up to Formula One, you know, the sacrifice from both parents, but represented by Lewis's dad in this instance, is so huge to get drivers to the level where they are. Then their parents live it with them, you know, and the families who have perhaps sacrificed other directions in their lives to get that individual to the place they now are, of course live that journey then vicariously through them with all of its ups and downs as they're in Formula One, and yeah, massively partisan to everything that goes on track. So to have that moment with the parent is it's more than just a proud dad, you know. There's a time in these guys' careers where it's dad, manager, trainer, financier, everything. So you're hugging your whole team there, you know, from the very beginning.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm hoping that Mercedes can keep this momentum going. They've won each of the last 2 races. George Russell's qualified in the top 4 in every race since Canada. What does Mercedes need to show you at Hungary to prove they can consistently battle Red Bull and McLaren at the top?
Well, they've been bringing a sequence of upgrades throughout, finishing off with a slightly lower downforce rear wing that they brought to Silverstone. And they've been improving and improving and improving and improving. And I'm waiting for that track to come. And every weekend we say, this is going to be the weekend where the circuit suits Red Bull again. And they're going to take off into the distance again like they did of old. And the circuits just aren't coming, right? Everybody looked at Silverstone and said, right, you've got a very high downforce circuit with extreme efficiency required. This is what the Red Bull is designed to do. And all the way back from Melbourne, where, you know, we convinced ourselves that Mercedes resurgence was because the corners were all very similar, all the way through Barcelona, where we sort of had a bit of a realization moment, coming back to Silverstone, where they actually, you know, given the picture, given the structure of the car's performance in our minds, they had no business being as strong as they are. I think they've already proven that. I think they've already proven that the resurgence is real and that they're here to stay at the front.
Keep my fingers crossed. I've heard rumors of more upgrades heading into the summer break, so hopefully this is just a sign of things to come for Mercedes. Alex, this is a great segue into our giveaway question. Rob, do you want to spin us up on that?
Yeah, absolutely, Adam. So every show, every week, we have a deadline stream before qualifying on the Saturday, Alex. We do a giveaway, and people from our community on FanAmp will enter the answer to the question, our weekly question. This week's question is, which driver group, i.e. the Brits or the non-Brits, will score more fantasy points in Hungary? And Adam and I have allied with the non-Brits, Oscar for me particularly as an Australian, and we've assigned you 3 of the more informed drivers at the moment in Lando, George and Lewis. Now, you've been a fantasy player this season, as we know, and we're curious to get your take on, even though we've assigned you these 3 guys on the left, whether or not you think that's a realistic possibility.
Let's see. We've got Oscar, we've got Carlos, and we've got Max. I think it is. I genuinely think it is. Starting right here, right now, through to the end of the year. Yeah, I think there's every chance those 3 drivers could score more points. This is literally just in Hungary.
Yes, just in Hungary.
Literally just in Hungary. Still think it's possible. It's possible. I think George and Lewis will definitely outscore Carlos and Oscar. The question will be how many points does Max score? But let's go with it. Let's back the Brits for now.
Okay. Look forward to it. They're in great form, so I'm sure it's not a bad shout whatsoever.
And Alex, we always challenge our F1 TV friends to a little friendly wager. So how about this? If you win, if the British team beats us, we'll send you a great prize from our sponsor at Fifth Gear Garms. But if we win, you've got to give us a shout out on your socials. How's that sound?
Shout out on the socials is absolutely fine. Is absolutely fine. And we could do a competition for the fifth gear garners as well. It would be better if some fans had that, wouldn't it? So let's give those away.
Definitely.
Fantastic. We will. And make sure you go to our fan app base and answer this question so you compete with us and Alex to see who gets the most points this week. All right, Rob, Alex, let's head over to our hit list for Hungary, where we're going to cover 3 of the top on-track and fantasy-relevant topics for this week. The first one for me is the battle between our top 3 constructors. A different constructor has been P1 in fantasy scoring in each of the last 3 races. You have Red Bull, who only have 1 driver in the fight, but Max has been steady, and they scored another 15 points at Silverstone for the fastest pit stop, so Red Bull are strong. Mercedes and McLaren are still 2 of the hottest constructors in the game, and over the last 5 races, nobody scored more points than Mercedes. So, Alex, do any of these teams have an inside edge at the Hungaroring, either historical preference or track layout that gives them that inside edge?
When I look at it, I mean, again, you'd normally say it was a Red Bull track. I would have said Silverstone was a Red Bull track. Then the downforce range they were in was a little bit too high, and they just had a little bit too much drag, which is so interesting when you consider the layout of Silverstone. I would always pile as much downforce as I could on the car, but of course, in Formula One, it's not necessarily about how much downforce you can get as it is about how much efficiency you have at the downforce range you need. So at Hungaroring, you're dealing with basically just a complete dirty downforce layout. There's really no high speed whatsoever. It should be a place where Red Bull come back to their previous strength. But we'll see. For me, what else? I think it could easily be quite warm. So in general, Mercedes might struggle a little bit, as they have tended to throughout the season so far in warmer conditions. So I would put Red Bull out front, then McLaren, then Mercedes in terms of the performance that I would discern.
I've always been wondering that. Mercedes struggles in the warm versus the cooler weather. What is the cutoff point before you start worrying about Mercedes? Is it proper summer days where it's hot versus right after a rainstorm in the spring things are cooler? Is there a sweet spot where after which maybe we shouldn't trust Mercedes so much?
That's a very boring depends, because it's a lot about how much downforce load the car puts through the tire. So that's what the car's not it's not like it's overheating the engine and going slower, right? So it's putting energy in the tire. They're finding the tire surface incredibly sensitive when they're trying to work the car. One of the same issues that Ferrari are having with this bouncing is actually it overheating the tire on the way down to the corner, and then the car doesn't perform. So for Mercedes at a high load circuit, medium or moderate temperature is a problem. At a low load circuit, they can get away with it being a little warmer. It's all about estimating at what point they overheat the tire surface.
That makes a lot of sense. And luckily for me, Pirelli puts out a really nice tire report at the start of each week. They can give me a sense of what sort of downforce we can be expecting, then we can balance that out with the temperature to predict Mercedes' effectiveness. And for McLaren, they've struggled with execution the last few weeks. They clearly have a fast car. They clearly have excellent drivers. What are some of the lessons learned they can take from the British Grand Prix as they sort of reform their approach for the upcoming races?
I mean, it's amazing because you look at Formula One and you think there are so many specific elements to being strong, but communication is the most universal, predictor of success or otherwise in business, in so many other facets of life. And communication's the problem, gaining firm lines of communication, understanding who's accountable for the various tasks and decisions that they make. For example, which tire compound you switch back to when you have a choice to come back from the intermediate, as they did at the end of the Grand Prix. They got that a little bit wrong back at Silverstone. Which lap you pit on and who makes that call. There's a lot of radio chatter, talk, discussion per decision is what we would consider so often in an endurance car. So you want the maximum decision for the minimum discussion, and they've just got that balance a little bit out at the moment in comparison to, for example, Red Bull, who are outstanding on their sort of discussion versus decision ratio.
I mean, a lot was said after the race when Lando was interviewed about the strategy there and how the onus was put on him, and he ultimately took the blame for that. But you'd think with all that information on the pit wall that you see how clean Red Bull are able to make those decisions in the spur of the moment. You know, McLaren just don't seem to have that sharpness when it comes to line ball decisions on track. So hopefully they can turn something around, but it hasn't been a great result for them in Silverstone, given everything that was set up for them.
And Rob, so going back to Red Bull, you have some great data, because I had talked at the beginning of this segment about how they've been fighting with one hand tied behind their back, and that's tied to some of the recent downfalls of Sergio Perez. Can you walk us through where he's at so we can talk about what's next for him?
Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise to anyone that Red Bull's struggles in the constructors are attributed to Sergio Perez's woes. And I think it's very much a tale of two drivers when you look at Max Verstappen's results and then Checo's, which have tailed off certainly since we've got to around the Miami or so part of the season. And you look at particularly since Monaco, Checo's had only 11 points compared to Nico Hülkenberg's 16, which is quite telling. A Haas, I think, still is the most proficient midfield car right now, but the fact that Checo's in what we would consider a championship winning car and is still being outscored by many midfield teams. I think another damning stat is that I think Logan Sargent has outqualified Sergio Perez 3 times in this Williams, more than his teammate Alex Albon. Definitely means that Red Bull do have their hands tied behind their back a little bit. Now, Alex, what's your take on Perez? You mentioned before earlier that, you know, they've re-signed him for another 2 years despite his obvious struggles, and we saw the same theme emerge about 12 months ago, just in terms of his fall off once we hit the European stages of the season. Do you think he's got a chance of turning this around? Do you think Red Bull are still the likely favourite to take out the constructors, or is it a situation where the rest of the field seem to have closed the gap and Perez may just not be able to recover?
I think it's important to caveat by saying that the performance of Perez at the start of this year was objectively fine. You know, you can't say, he was there, he was second to Max, he was delivering sort of close to the performance of the car. I think there are a lot of engineers now around the paddock operating on a standard offset to Perez, which is super harsh when a driver can have a good day and be still back towards the front of the field. That being said, I think, you know, the pace offset is one thing. Everybody knows that Verstappen is a generational talent. He's doing the job in that Red Bull, a job that not many other drivers could do in it. What's putting Sergio in danger are mistakes like he made at Silverstone. You know, an outlap, an error, finding himself in the gravel and not making his way out of even Q1. Right, it's a huge issue, and those are positions that they can't throw away. Not only because they need to take the points from Perez for the Constructors' Championship, which is important, but also because then Max has one shot in a changeable weather Grand Prix to take on 2 Mercedes they can split and 2 McLarens they can split every weekend. And they can't have that. They can't have that at Red Bull. It was okay, as you guys correctly say, when they had the car and they could charge off into the distance and Sergio could finish third. Now they've got a battle on their hands, and that's why I think this discussion is starting to loom and roll on again. But I don't see any reason when we take off into the sticks again at the end of the year that Perez can't rejoin the pace of Max. There's nothing that says he wouldn't be able to do that and must do that if he's going to retain the seat.
Yeah, I mean, they've obviously just re-signed him for another 2 years, and the driver market is as fluid as ever at the moment. I know there's been speculation that there could still be a mid-season swap if he doesn't hit the benchmarks or the targets that Red Bull have set him. Christian Horner's obviously said that Checo is aware of what he needs to do to meet those targets. But we look at, other drivers waiting in the wings, and I know Adam wants to unpack the predictions for the driver market. Do you see, although it may seem unrealistic, Sergio Perez losing his seat before the end of the season or by next season if things don't turn around?
It's one of those things where contract lengths in motorsport are sort of notional. So it's a really strange thing. We think we're so used to contracts of employment in the rest of the world being 2 years, and 2 years is as long as you stay. In motorsport, you cannot, as a driver, force a team to run you in the car. That's the first thing. It's not deemed safe or secure for understandable reasons to continue with a team as a driver if the team no longer have confidence in you and don't want you there. So that's a case of money. We're dealing with some of the most profitable Formula One teams that there have ever been, given the cost cap and the extreme marketing success of F1 at the moment, which is fantastic. But that means, can they release Perez if they want to on the basis of non-performance? Absolutely. Should they? It's on a knife edge right now. Another couple of races like the couple of races he's just had, and I think stakeholders will start to request that. A good couple of races, and just like every other driver who struggled for a few races and then recovered it, he could be back in the good books again and charging off into the rest of his 2-year contract.
And as we look at some of the impatience of Red Bull and some of the options in the driver market, what do you think is more likely to happen? Liam Lawson replacing Daniel Ricciardo at RB, or Daniel Ricciardo replacing Sergio Perez either at the end of this year or early next year at Red Bull?
Well, it depends on the performance of Perez, but I think Lawson, has been promised a contract in 2025, or they release him. Now, that's the undertaking that's been made. Helmut Marko's detailed that. I don't think or they release him for a driver in Liam Lawson's position is actually that much of a strong position of leverage, because release him to where? Lawson's been in the Red Bull system. It's not like Mercedes are bashing down the door and saying, hey, Liam, we need to put you in Lewis Hamilton's seat for next year. So, again, is that a real position of contractual strength for Liam? No. But I think it's probably, it'll be completely in response to the position of Perez. Through to next year. I think whichever seat is preferable, they'll definitely put Liam in, and then maybe an Isaac Hadjar will go in the other seat, to fill the remaining void.
It's a good position to be in. They have too much talent for how many seats they have on the grid. And looking back at Red Bull as a fantasy asset, over the first 5 races, they averaged 89 points, the constructor, whereas the last 5 races, they've averaged 45. But even though it's been a big drop-off in form, like Alex mentioned, Perez can rebound and get them back to those winning ways. And also, 45 points per week still puts them around P2, P3 as a constructor. So still a very steady asset for F1 fantasy strategists. Rob, going from one struggling entity to another, Alex, I want to talk about Ferrari next. And after getting knocked out in Q2 at Silverstone, Charles Leclerc said, quote, "We are just really slow." And at the British Grand Prix, they ran 2 specs of their car. Charles with the recent upgrades, but he loses time in the high-speed corners. Sainz with the Imola spec that loses time in the low-speed corners. How does Ferrari right the ship and get back to the top of the grid?
Honestly, it's probably one of the worst engineering disasters a Formula One team can have. It happened a little bit to Haas in the middle of last year. Do you remember when they turned up to Kota with a full raft of upgrades and just didn't improve at all? Can you imagine sitting there in the F1 team? You've been waiting for the upgrades, tracking their progress, testing them all, throw them on the car, and no more pace. And what's more, one of your drivers definitely doesn't like them and the other one's not sure. So you've got to go back to for me. You've got to go back to square one and then take another branch of the tree. Unfortunately, there's in engineering terms, so you take another direction. Unfortunately, there is always a deadweight loss involved in doing that because you've spent engineering time. One of the lucky things for Ferrari is that the aerodynamic testing quotas have just been reset, so they can go back and try and rejig the aerodynamic componentry of the car within the cost cap. But I honestly think, talking fantasy, they're going to be a weaker asset, at least for a phase of the year, if not for the rest of the year.
Yeah, it's been really telling the last few races. Charles Leclerc has struggled. That DNF in Canada for Sainz and Charles himself was not a great result. And, as you've pointed out, Alex, it seems to have set them back. I think Sainz also said it's maybe 2 to 3 months worth of lost development time at Silverstone. So you make a good point. To go back to the tree, you kind of have to probably wait that same amount of time to get back to where you want to be, right? So we may not see any meaningful strides until after the summer break, you'd have to think, right?
And this is really important because Ferrari are the most selected constructor in the game at 36%. That's more than double Mercedes. It's more than Red Bull. It's more than McLaren. So if we predict that Ferrari is going to take a few races to get things sorted, this is a great time to get out of them and find one of those constructors that will bring a little bit more optimism in the last few races before the summer break. Now, Alex, let's ask you the Fan Amp pick of the week. So we have a pick 'em on the Fan Amp app where fans can win prizes by correctly guessing some qualifying and race results throughout the season. And our question this week is, will both Ferrari drivers make it to Q3 at Hungary? What do you think?
Will both Ferrari drivers make it to Q3 in Hungary? No. Downforce power unit. Yes. I think they will. And the reason I think they will is because I think that they'll have the grunt to do so. I mean, they've got a decent amount of punch, which is very important in Hungary, from the base of the power unit. And also, even though they've taken the wrong aerodynamic direction, that Ferrari remains good in the mechanical sections of the racetrack. So I think whilst they're still back from the very leading runners, I think they'll clear, your Astons and your Williamses and everyone else and put both cars into Q3. Yeah.
Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, I have to agree. I do think, even though it was a disappointing Saturday for Ferrari, I'm sure it's a bit of a red herring, pardon the pun there. But I do suspect they'll turn it around. They may not be inside the top 3 teams again, but I do think the car is still good enough to certainly outperform the likes of the rest of the midfield team. I'd say Nico Hülkenberg's probably the smoky. He definitely looks like the man in form at the moment, but I do think they'll still be able to sneak that in if you're saying there's 3 available slots, aside from the remaining top 3 teams in Hulk.
It's a just, isn't it? It's just.
Yeah.
For Ferrari, which is a shame.
I agree with both of you for the same reason. I think they'll both be into Q3, but it won't be pretty and they won't be contending for pole. Rob, let's walk through one of my favorite parts of the show is how do we optimize our guests' lineup so that they can get some fantasy success in the coming weeks? Walk us through Alex's team.
Yeah, so Alex, we've obviously got your team on the left-hand side of the screen here. We've been following your progress in the F1 Live League on the F1 Fantasy website, where you're currently 8th. And I think you're really only a few decisions away from ascending up the leaderboard. We've obviously helped out Laura and Chris earlier in the season, and we're not going to take any credit for their successes, but we hopefully imparted a few pearls of wisdom that maybe set them apart from their competitors in the field. So hopefully we can do the same to you, lift your team from what we would say the midfield on the leaderboard to hopefully a podium by the end of the season. Now we've got double Mercedes, Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon, Nico Hülkenberg, RB and Ferrari on here. And we've taken a look at it. I think you've got the makings of a couple of really good kind of hold assets throughout the season, or for the next few races at the very least. But I think there's probably a couple of things that maybe you could tweak or think about changing to move your team in a different direction? Because you obviously talked about the success of Mercedes recently, and we know how good McLaren is. So there's a couple of different approaches, and we also know there's, I think, a couple of chips like the wild card that you might be able to use to enforce some of these updates. We've got a couple of alternatives on the screen here. Where do you feel like you could take this team to the second half of the season? And I'm not saying what we've got is gospel, but I don't know what you'd make of these changes here.
To be honest, guys, I rock up at the F1 weekend and I'm like, oh yeah, fantasy. Right, cool. What am I going to do? And then so often I get dragged into Formula 3 and Formula 2 broadcast, and then someone will look at me and goes, you locked in your fantasy team before qualifying, right? And I go, no. So that's a killer. But I definitely agree with. I mean, K-Mag is a strong look. That's an interesting one from you guys. I do agree with getting rid of the RB. I believe they put that in response to the big upgrade package they brought, which didn't work a few races ago. I would clear Ferrari and put Mercedes in and McLaren in as a pair of constructors. If I then have to sacrifice Hamilton at this phase of the season, that's a shame. But so be it.
There's absolutely nothing wrong with keeping Lewis Hamilton. There's certainly routes to including him in your team and bolstering other parts of the lineup. And, you know, what I think the great thing about the constructors in Mercedes and McLaren have is that you're essentially getting a cut of Lewis's fantasy points anyway. So that was kind of the logic behind the team on the right-hand side, where you do make 5 changes, but using, I believe, the wildcard, which you still have in play, could certainly be one such route to including that. We've got Lando Norris, and I would happily be convinced otherwise by you if you think Lewis's fandom is enough to sneak him ahead. But the reason Adam and I are thinking Lando is because of his driver of the day potential. And up until most recently in Silverstone, I think Lando had won 5 out of the last 6 awards, including the one in Austria where he didn't even finish the race. So we do suspect Lando has almost a guaranteed 10-point head start, or let's call it maybe like 75% of getting a 10-point head start on just about any other driver. So that's why Adam and I like Lando. But I do think with Lewis winning in Silverstone, maybe some of his other fans have come out of the woodwork, and moving into Hungary and beyond, we do see a few more Lewis Hamilton driver of the days. So we could squeeze him in. But I'm obviously happy to be guided by you if you have a particular sense around one driver or another.
No, definitely. I see what you mean. I didn't know you got points for the driver of the day stuff. So yeah, Lando's a shoo-in on that one, isn't he? Absolutely every single week. I'm normally, when driver of the day comes out, I'm normally running from the office at F1 TV to the paddock to try to ascertain our position for the post-race show. So I often miss it, but then I do figure out it's Lando afterwards, so it's a great count.
And also, Alex, too, the midfield drivers we selected, we spread some of that budget around the midfield because those Haas drivers are among the top 5 in the entire game for overtakes, which is a really points-boosting category for the midfield. And also, Kevin Magnussen leads all assets right now in value gain throughout the season. So if you get these midfield drivers, they grow their value. That helps us afford better drivers later in the season. So we're just trying to load you up with those midfield drivers that will really soar for you. And we noticed that you had a lot of budget that wasn't spent, too, from your previous races. We want to try to pump that back into your team, get some of that value going for this week.
Yeah, definitely. All right, guys, I'm gonna take your advice. That's for sure. And I've got time before Hungaroring, so I've got time. So I'm gonna do it.
Fantastic. And now that you've been on the show, Alex, you have a direct line to Rob and I. If you ever have questions, want to run a team by us, if you want us to poke you and remind you to set your fantasy lineup, we're here for you.
Now I know how Laura and Chris have been doing such a good job of it. There we go. There we go.
I think something we will say is that Alex's budget, for those of you watching, is around 117 million, which is probably the midpoint for a lot of teams. We have teams that also play at 112 million and 122 million for those that have been able to ride those higher value gaining assets. So Adam and I, as always, will be active on Twitter in the next week and a half until the Hungaroring. And so we can answer any questions around lineups and particular budget ranges if you want to tackle us with any questions.
Absolutely. Now, Alex, let's show off a little bit and show you our live league that we have. So we were approached by F1 at the start of the season to have a featured league in the game, just like your team with the F1 Live group. We have 100,000 teams in our league this year, and so this is the part of the show every week where we showcase some of those top scoring teams. And moving up to P1 in the league this week was Leapers 1. And Leapfrog, he's always active on our community, he's active on our live shows, he's all over the F1 fantasy community, so I'm so glad to see Andrew in P1 in our league. He's actually P3 in the entire world right now, so congratulations to Andrew. This was a team that ran Lando, Lewis, McLaren, and Mercedes, so a really good result for him.
Yeah, that one might have worked out pretty well, I can imagine, yeah.
Excellent. Now let's look at the F1 Live League, just to give you an update on the leaderboard there. We've got a nice little graphic showing Laura and our friend Chris McCarthy in P1 and P2, with Lawrence Barreto right behind in P3. Alex, how are you feeling about the rest of the season? Who do you think could move up and down this leaderboard? Can Laura hang on to that lead?
I think if Laura keeps on ringing you guys up and having you help with her team, then she definitely will. Chris McCarthy, I can imagine being very studious about the whole thing, as I can with Bazman, Lawrence Barreto. So I think it's all to play for. I'd like to have Buxton if I could. I reckon a top 5 finish would be a good outcome for the league. At least I'm clear of Hinch and Valsecchi at the moment, so I've got two drivers behind me, so I'm happy with that.
That's perfect. At the start of the season, we joked because everybody's team name has the owner's name underneath it, but yours didn't, and I thought, is Martin playing fantasy this year? What's it?
I don't know how to set that, honestly. Like I literally. It's not something I know a huge amount about. Like I'm really enjoying your guys' expertise and insight into it. But I'm like, how does this thing work? Most of the time, one week I did like 5 transfers, and then I was like, whoa, where's all my money gone? So but I'm enjoying it more and more as I go through the season. So yeah, no, it's definitely me. I promise.
I'm sure.
Fantastic.
I'm sure with hopefully a bit of well-placed advice, we can right the ship. And as you say, I don't think top 5 is out of the question whatsoever. Only a couple of hundred or so points separating you from Jolly and Palmer. And as I think I mentioned before, you've got the wild card. I think you may have a few other powerful chips up your sleeve. And I think with a couple of sprint races still to go this season, there'll be opportune times to use those. But one thing I would like to get your take on, Alex, is there any banter you guys do have? I know you mentioned before Laura is obviously top of the leaderboard, and you're in some cases scrambling to set your lineup between different commitments on the race weekend. Do you guys have any banter before the show starts, the race week warm up, or anything like that?
Definitely. I mean, the main thing is, because obviously we're all supposed to be neutral throughout, right? So every so often someone will celebrate violently in the office, and we look across and we're like, were we supporting specific driver X? And then that individual will just look back and be like, fantasy team, and you'll be like, oh right, yeah, okay, fantasy team, I get it, right, fine. Just why is somebody getting so heated over Nico Hulkenberg making his way into the top 8? You know, it's a fantasy thing.
Glad to see I'm not the only one that does that.
Yeah.
And also, too, Rob brought up a great point about the chips that are left. You and Chris both have the limitless chip left, so you have an unlimited budget, can make an unlimited number of transfers for 1 week, and if you do it on a sprint weekend, you can score a ton of points. I think it's going to be a great windfall for both of you.
Yeah, we'll load those up and deliver them to a sprint weekend and jump up the standings.
Excellent. Well, Alex, you have survived the fantasy formula. Thank you so much for coming on. Could you tell all of our viewers where they can find you and what's next for Brundle Motorsport?
Well, where they can find me, you can find me on all English-speaking feeds for Formula 2 and Formula 3. You can find me on F1 TV for Formula 1, various different broadcasts for endurance racing, including the World Endurance Championship. What's next for Brundle Motorsport is the debut of our Mini Cooper Mark 1. That's going to be at the Brands Hatch Mini Festival, and then the biggest event of one of the biggest events of the year, the Silverstone Classic Festival, where we'll have 3 or 4 cars racing. So that's about it. My next time behind the wheel myself, not driving for my own team, will be at Mulner. Will be with Mulner Motorsports and the NLS, the series that races at the Nürburgring Nordschleife, and that is the first weekend of August. So looking forward to that.
Can't wait.
Looks like you have a busy month ahead.
Yeah.
Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Best of luck to you and Brundle Motorsport in these events in the next few weeks, and I look forward to seeing the Brustang on the podium this time next month. Thank you all for watching, and we'll be back with Terry and our live show this Saturday at 9 a.m. Eastern before lineups lock for the Hungarian Grand Prix. We'll see you then.